Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or professional advice. Divorce laws, tax regulations, and financial outcomes vary significantly based on state jurisdiction and individual circumstances. The concepts discussed here are based on historical trends and sociological case studies, rather than specific legal instructions. We are not attorneys, financial advisors, or mental health professionals. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified legal and financial experts before making any decisions regarding their domestic or financial status. There is a silent epidemic in the United States that is dismantling the American middle class faster than inflation, outsourcing, or the rising cost of higher education combined. For the modern American man, the greatest threat to his long-term social mobility and the preservation of his legacy isn't a stock market crash or a sudden job loss. It is the dissolution of his marriage. We have been conditioned by media and culture to view divorce through a lens of emotional trauma or social failure, but we rarely discuss it for what it truly is: a catastrophic economic event that acts as a structural barrier to wealth accumulation for decades. When a household splits, the math of upward mobility does not simply divide by two. In many historical trends, it resets the timeline entirely, sending men who spent 15 years climbing the social ladder back to the bottom rung of the previous decade. If you are a man in America today, understanding the intersection of domestic law and economic survival is no longer optional. It is the difference between achieving the American dream or watching it be liquidated in a high-stakes courtroom. Today, we are beginning a 10-part masterclass on the reality of divorce for men and its direct impact on U.S. social mobility. This series will provide a deep dive into the structural mechanics of why some men recover while others fall into a permanent cycle of downward mobility, analyzing the data behind the wealth gap that opens the moment the papers are filed. To understand why divorce is such a potent disruptor of social mobility, we must first define what social mobility looks like in the 21st century. In the United States, social mobility is the ability of an individual or family to improve their economic status over time. Traditionally, this is achieved through the accumulation of assets, the scaling of career income, and the power of compound interest. However, the American economy has evolved into a system that is fundamentally calibrated for the dual-income household. The cost of housing, healthcare, and education in major U.S. hubs has scaled to meet the purchasing power of two earners. When a divorce occurs, that economic unit is shattered, but the cost of living does not revert to a single-person baseline. Instead, both parties often find themselves attempting to maintain a two-earner lifestyle on a single-earner budget, while simultaneously servicing the debt and legal fees associated with the split. For many men, this creates a liquidity crisis that halts their upward trajectory indefinitely. Consider the historical trend of asset division regarding the primary residence. For the majority of American families, the home is the primary vehicle for wealth creation. It is not just a place to live. It is a forced savings account and a source of leverage. In a divorce, the equity in that home is often split, which frequently necessitates a forced sale of the property. In a high-interest rate environment, the man is then forced to re-enter the housing market as a single buyer, often with half the down payment he previously had and a significantly higher debt-to-income ratio. This is the first major blow to social mobility. He moves from being a homeowner with a growing equity stake to a renter or a buyer of a significantly diminished asset. The wealth that took a decade to build is fragmented, and the potential for that wealth to compound is lost. Furthermore, we must examine the concept of the marriage premium versus the divorce penalty. Sociological data has long suggested that married men tend to earn more, save more, and live longer than their single counterparts. This is often attributed to the stability and division of labor within a household that allows a man to focus on career scaling. When that structure is removed, the divorce penalty kicks in. This isn't just about the immediate loss of half of one's net worth. It is about the long-term erosion of earning potential. The psychological toll of a high-conflict divorce can lead to what researchers call a productivity plateau. Just as a man enters his peak earning years, typically between the ages of 35 and 55, the administrative and emotional burden of divorce can cause him to stagnate in his career. He may pass up promotions, avoid high-stakes risks, or suffer from burnout, all of which have a cumulative effect on his lifetime earnings. When you factor in the loss of professional momentum, the total economic cost of a divorce can be measured in the millions of dollars over a lifetime. Then, there is the matter of the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO. This is the legal mechanism used to divide retirement accounts like 401ks and IRAs. For a man who has diligently contributed to his retirement for 20 years, seeing that balance cut in half at age 45 is a mathematical nightmare. Because of the way compound interest works, the money lost in a divorce at age 45 is far more valuable than the money contributed at age 25. He cannot simply work harder to make up the difference, because he has lost the most valuable asset in investing time. This specific interaction between family law and the mathematics of finance is a primary driver of downward social mobility for older men, who may find themselves working well into their 70s because their retirement floor was pulled out from under them in their 40s. We also have to look at the fixed costs that follow a divorce, such as child support and alimony. While these are intended to provide equity and support for children, from a purely economic standpoint, they function as a significant tax on a man's future growth. Unlike other expenses, these are often non-negotiable and prioritized by the state. For a man trying to rebuild his life, these fixed costs can consume 30% to 50% of his take-home pay. This leaves very little seed capital for new investments or business ventures. In the United States, the ability to move up the social ladder is dependent on having discretionary income to put into the market. When that income is diverted to support a second household, the man is effectively locked into his current social strata. He is working at a high level but living at a much lower one, creating a disconnect between his social standing and his actual financial reality. In this deep dive, we are going to look at case studies of men who have navigated these waters. We will see that the difference between those who maintain their social mobility and those who fall into the divorce trap often comes down to their understanding of these structural forces early in the process. This isn't about bitterness. It is about the cold, hard reality of the U.S. economic system. We are going to explore how the velocity of wealth changes post-divorce, and why the American legal system's approach to asset division can sometimes create a permanent underclass of formerly middle-class men. This is the story of the modern American male's struggle to keep his footing on a ladder that has become increasingly slippery. If you want to understand how to protect your future, or if you want to understand why the economic landscape for men looks the way it does today, you need to see how these pieces fit together. This is part 1 of our 10-part deep dive. We are just scratching the surface of the data, the history, and the potential outcomes of the Great American Divorce. To understand the mechanics of downward social mobility, we must first look at the immediate financial shockwave that occurs the moment a legal separation begins in 2026. This is not just a change in marital status. It is the activation of an exit tax on a man's accumulated wealth. Imagine a professional named James, a 44-year-old senior project manager living in a high-cost area like Northern Virginia. In 2026, James earns a respectable salary of $165,000 a year. On paper, he is the embodiment of the American middle class. He has a $400,000 home equity stake, 2 vehicles, and a growing retirement portfolio. However, the moment the divorce process initiates, James enters a state of financial paralysis that historical trends suggest can last for 3 to 7 years. The first step in this downward trajectory is the liquidity trap. Most men in the United States have their net worth tied up in illiquid assets: home equity, retirement accounts, and professional tools or businesses. When the legal process starts, James is immediately hit with a retainer fee for legal counsel. In the current 2026 economic landscape, a specialized family law attorney in a major metropolitan area often requires an initial retainer ranging from $15,000 to $30,000. This is cash that must be liquid. If James does not have this in a checking account, he is forced to use credit or high-interest personal loans, immediately increasing his debt-to-income ratio. This is the first crack in his social mobility. He is no longer building wealth. He is servicing the cost of dismantling it. As the case progresses, the concept of the status quo order often comes into play. In many jurisdictions, courts will issue orders requiring the primary earner to maintain the financial standard of the household during the litigation. For James, this means he must continue to pay the mortgage, utilities, and insurance for the marital home where he may no longer reside. Simultaneously, he must find a new place to live. In 2026, the rental market in American hubs remains aggressive. James finds himself paying $3,000 a month for a modest one-bedroom apartment, while still being legally obligated to cover the $4,000 mortgage and tax bill for the family home. Suddenly, 70% of his take-home pay is evaporated by housing costs alone. This is what sociologists call the dual household burden. It is a structural impossibility for a single income to support two separate middle-class lifestyles without exhausting all savings. Now, consider the role of professional valuation and forensic accounting. If James had been an entrepreneur instead of an employee, let us call this case study Marcus, the situation becomes even more complex. Marcus owns a small logistics firm in 2026. In a divorce, his business is not just a source of income. It is a marital asset. The court requires a business valuation, which involves hiring forensic accountants at an hourly rate that often exceeds that of the attorneys. Marcus must pay for his own experts and in many cases, is ordered to pay for his spouse's experts as well. This creates a war of attrition where the very capital Marcus needs to grow his business and maintain his social standing is instead diverted into the pockets of the divorce industrial complex. Historical trends show that small businesses owned by men undergoing divorce often see a 20 to 30% drop in revenue due to the owner's distraction and the extraction of working capital to pay for litigation. This isn't just a personal loss. It is the destruction of a wealth-generating engine. Step by step, the wealth that James or Marcus spent 2 decades building is liquidated to pay for the process of its own division. When the time comes to settle the marital estate, the primary residence, the cornerstone of American social mobility, is often sold. In 2026, with interest rates sitting at historical averages that make new mortgages expensive, the equity James receives after the sale and the payment of real estate commissions is significantly diminished. If he walked away with $200,000 in equity in 2023, he might have been able to put that down on a new home. But in 2026, that same $200,000 buys far less house, and the monthly payment on his new, smaller residence is higher than the payment on his old, larger home. He has effectively moved backward in time. He is living in the type of home he occupied in his late 20s, but he is now in his mid-40s with fewer years of earning potential remaining. We must also analyze the opportunity cost of this period. Social mobility is driven by the ability to take risks, to invest in a new venture, to relocate for a better job, or to pursue advanced certification. During a high-conflict divorce, a man's risk tolerance drops to 0. He cannot move for a better job because of custody ties and court jurisdictions. He cannot invest because his assets are frozen or being scrutinized. He is stuck in a holding pattern. While his peers are using their peak earning years to maximize their positions, the divorcing man is focused entirely on defense. Every month spent in litigation is a month where the power of compound interest is working against him rather than for him. If the process takes 2 years, he hasn't just lost 2 years of savings, he has lost the 30 years of growth those savings would have generated by the time he reaches retirement. The psychological impact further compounds the economic reality. In our case study of James, the stress of maintaining peak performance at a high-level corporate job, while managing hundreds of emails from legal counsel leads to professional stagnation. He misses out on a promotion to a director-level role because he simply doesn't have the mental bandwidth to lead a new initiative. This loss of a potential $30,000 annual raise is a permanent blow to his lifetime earning trajectory. When we talk about social mobility, we are talking about the slope of the line on a graph. Divorce doesn't just lower the line, it flattens the slope. But what happens when the final decree is signed? For many men, they believe the bleeding has stopped. In reality, they are about to enter the most challenging phase of the economic reset. They are now facing the long-term reality of support payments and the tax implications of their new filing status. In 2026, the tax code has significant implications for single filers versus those filing jointly. And for many men, this transition results in a higher effective tax rate on a lower net income. They are earning more, paying more to the government, and keeping less than they ever have before. This creates a ceiling on their ability to ever re-enter the upper middle class. As we move forward in this deep dive, we have to look at the silent killer of male wealth, the long-tail impact of transfer payments. If James is ordered to pay child support and alimony, he is effectively functioning as a high-income earner with a low-income lifestyle for the next decade. He is an economic ghost, haunting a social class he can no longer afford to inhabit. This brings us to a critical question that few are willing to ask. Is the current American legal framework for divorce actively creating a demographic of men who are permanently locked out of the American dream they already worked to achieve? In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the math of the monthly drain. We will break down exactly how alimony and child support formulas are calculated in different U.S. states, and how these numbers interact with the rising cost of living in 2026 to create a mathematical impossibility for wealth rebuilding. We will explore the concept of the imputed income trap and why even losing your job won't necessarily stop the financial hemorrhage. You need to understand the structural mechanics of the support system before you can ever hope to navigate it. The transition from the immediate shock to the long-term grind is where most men lose their grip on the ladder of social mobility. We are going to show you why. To understand why the monthly financial drain is the most significant hurdle to social mobility, we must look at the transition from a consolidated household budget to the bifurcated economic reality of 2026. In the United States, social mobility is fueled by the margin. The margin is the percentage of income remaining after all essential living expenses are paid. This is the capital used for investing, scaling a business, or funding a child's specialized education. When a man enters the post-divorce phase, his margin is often not just reduced, it is frequently eliminated or turned into a deficit. This creates a state of economic stagnation where a man is working at peak capacity simply to remain stationary. Let us examine the case study of David, a 42-year-old software architect in Austin, Texas, in 2026. David earns a gross salary of $18,000 per month. In his married life, this income, combined with the spouse's moderate income, allowed for a high-mobility lifestyle. A mortgage on a suburban home, maximum contributions to retirement accounts, and a diversified investment portfolio. However, the potential outcomes of his divorce decree fundamentally alter the physics of his finances. First, we must analyze the mechanics of child support. In many U.S. jurisdictions, child support is calculated using the income shares model. This model is based on the idea that children should receive the same proportion of parental income that they would have received if the parents lived together. In David's case, for 2 children, a state-mandated formula might determine that the total cost of raising those children is $4,000 a month. Based on the income ratio between David and his former spouse, he may be responsible for 80% of that, or $3,200. This is a non-negotiable after-tax payment. Unlike a car payment or a gym membership, this cannot be deferred or refinanced. It is a fixed anchor on his cash flow. Next, we add the layer of spousal support or alimony. Since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which took full effect for divorces finalized after 2018, alimony is no longer tax-deductible for the payer in the United States. In 2026, this remains one of the most significant structural barriers to male social mobility. Imagine David is ordered to pay $2,500 a month in alimony for a duration of 5 years. Because this is not deductible, David must first pay federal income tax, Social Security, and Medicare on that money. To give his former spouse $2,500, David actually has to earn roughly $4,000 in gross income. When you combine the $3,200 in child support and the $2,500 in alimony, David is making transfer payments of $5,700 every month from his after-tax income. If his take-home pay after taxes and insurance is $11,000, he is left with $5,300 to rebuild his entire life. In a high-cost-of-living city like Austin in 2026, where a modest 2-bedroom apartment near his office costs $3,000, David is left with $2,300 for food, utilities, car payments, fuel, and the expenses associated with having his children during his custody time. His margin for investment and upward mobility has completely vanished. He is a high earner living a paycheck-to-paycheck existence. This leads us into the concept of the imputed income trap, a critical mechanism in the U.S. family court system that can freeze a man's social mobility, even in the face of economic hardship. Imagine if David, due to the immense stress of the divorce and the tech industry volatility of 2026, is laid off or suffers a medical event that prevents him from working at his current level. He might seek a lower-stress job that pays $90,000 a year instead of $216,000. In many case studies, the court may refuse to lower his support obligations, practicing what is known as imputing income. The court may rule that David has the earning capacity of $216,000, and therefore must continue to pay support based on that imaginary number. This forces men into a state of involuntary high-performance. They cannot pivot, they cannot retrain, and they cannot take an entry-level position in a new, more promising field. They are legally tethered to a specific career path and income level, regardless of their personal or professional well-being. Furthermore, we must address the loss of the married filing jointly tax status. In 2026, The tax brackets for single filers are significantly less favorable than for married couples. David is now paying a higher percentage of his remaining income to the federal government. He has lost the ability to claim many of the credits and deductions that helped build his wealth during his marriage. This is a quiet, monthly erosion of capital. Over a decade, the difference between filing as a married couple versus filing as a single person, while making high support payments, can amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost opportunity for wealth accumulation. To illustrate the step-by-step reality of this drain, imagine the process of David trying to save for a down payment on a new home. In his previous life, he could save $4,000 a month. Now, with a $2,300 monthly surplus before food and fuel, his actual savings rate might be $500 a month. To save the $100,000 needed for a down payment on a standard home in 2026, it will now take him nearly 17 years instead of 2. By the time he re-enters the housing market, he will be nearly 60 years old. This is the definition of downward social mobility. He has not just been delayed. He has been structurally excluded from the primary wealth-building vehicle of the American middle class during his most productive years. Another historical trend to consider is the cost of maintaining two lifestyles. When David has his children for his 50% custody time, he must provide a home with bedrooms for them, a second set of toys, clothing, and high-speed internet for their schoolwork. He is essentially paying for 100% of the infrastructure for his children while also paying his former spouse to provide that same infrastructure in her home. This redundancy is an economic inefficiency that single-earner households struggle to absorb. In the United States, social mobility is often a game of efficiency. The most efficient households survive and thrive. Divorce is the ultimate economic inefficiency. This brings us to a phenomenon known as the working-class wealthy. These are men who appear in the top 10% of earners in the United States based on their W-2 forms, but whose standard of living and net worth growth are more in line with the bottom 40%. They drive older vehicles, they do not vacation, and they have no liquid emergency fund. This disconnect creates a unique form of social alienation. They are expected to contribute to society and their professions at a high achiever level, but they receive none of the traditional economic rewards of that achievement. As we conclude this look at the monthly drain, it becomes clear that the legal and tax structures of 2026 are not designed for the recovery of the male earner. The focus is on the immediate equitable distribution of existing assets and the maintenance of the children's lifestyle, but often at the cost of the father's long-term economic viability. If a man cannot save, he cannot invest. If he cannot invest, he cannot move up. He becomes a permanent renter of his own life. But the monthly drain is only the beginning of the structural barrier. There is another, more invisible force that can prevent a man from ever getting back on his feet, and it has nothing to do with how much he earns. It has to do with his ability to access capital. In the next part of this deep dive, we are going to explore the catastrophic impact of divorce on a man's credit profile and his borrowing power. We will look at how joint debt, missed payments during the litigation phase, and the sudden change in debt-to-income ratios can make a man radioactive to lenders in 2026. If you think having a high salary will save you, wait until you see what a divorce decree does to your FICO score. We will break down why your credit is your true lifeline for social mobility, and how easily it can be severed. In the United States, your credit score is the silent architect of your social mobility. It is the gatekeeper that determines the cost of your future, and your ability to leverage other people's money to build your own. For a man navigating the economic fallout of a divorce in 2026, his credit profile often undergoes a period of extreme volatility that can effectively shut him out of the financial markets for years. This is not just about a numerical dip on a screen. It is about the destruction of his borrowing power at the exact moment he needs it most to rebuild. To understand this, we have to look at the intersection of contract law and family law, two systems that often move in opposite directions during a domestic split. Consider the case study of Robert, a 48-year-old senior analyst in Charlotte, North Carolina. In early 2026, Robert had a pristine FICO score of 810. He had spent 2 decades curating a perfect credit history, allowing him to access the lowest possible interest rates on mortgages, auto loans, and business lines of credit. He viewed his credit as his ultimate safety net. However, the moment he and his spouse separated, that net began to fray. The fundamental problem is that while a divorce decree might state that one spouse is responsible for a specific joint debt, the original contract with the lender remains unchanged. If the mortgage on the marital home is in both names and the spouse remaining in the home misses a single payment, Robert's 810 score will plummet regardless of what his divorce papers say. In the fast-paced 2026 lending environment, a single 30-day delinquency on a mortgage can result in a drop of 100 points or more. For Robert, this is a catastrophic outcome. Historical trends show that during the high-conflict phase of a divorce, joint obligations are frequently neglected, sometimes as a result of financial distress, and sometimes as a strategic maneuver. If Robert's spouse fails to pay the joint credit card bills or the car note during the litigation, Robert is legally and financially tethered to that failure. Because lenders are not parties to the divorce proceedings, they have no legal obligation to honor the family court's division of debts. They only care about the signatures on the original loan documents. Imagine if Robert attempts to secure a new apartment or purchase a small townhome to establish his new life. In 2026, landlords and mortgage lenders have significantly increased their scrutiny of credit reports due to ongoing economic instability. When they see a sudden drop in score and a pending legal action, Robert is flagged as a high-risk borrower. Even if he has a high salary, his inability to prove financial stability through his credit score means he will either be denied outright or forced to pay a higher security deposit and a predatory interest rate. This is the first major structural barrier to his recovery. He is being charged a premium for his survival. We must also dive deep into the debt-to-income or DTI ratio. This is perhaps the most misunderstood metric in male social mobility post-divorce. Lenders typically want to see a total DTI ratio of 43% or lower to qualify for a conventional mortgage. When a lender looks at Robert in 2026, they don't just look at his rent and his car payment, they look at his court-ordered support obligations. In many historical trends, lenders treat alimony and child support as a recurring monthly debt, similar to a credit card or a student loan payment. If Robert earns $15,000 a month but pays $6,000 in combined support, the lender subtracts that $6,000 from his qualifying income. Suddenly, for the purposes of buying a home, Robert is no longer a high-earning analyst. He is viewed as a man earning $9,000 a month who already has a $6,000 debt load. This pushes his DTI into the stratosphere. Even with a decent credit score, the sheer volume of his transfer payments makes it mathematically impossible for him to qualify for a loan to buy a property comparable to the one he just lost. He is effectively forced into the rental market, where he builds no equity and receives no tax benefits, further widening the gap between his current reality and his former social standing. Then there is the issue of weaponized credit. In some high-conflict case studies, we see the intentional maximization of joint credit lines. If a couple has a joint credit card with a $50,000 limit that was previously unused, one party may decide to utilize that entire limit for legal fees or living expenses during the separation. Robert is now responsible for a massive balance that increases his credit utilization ratio overnight. High utilization is the second fastest way to kill a credit score after late payments. By the time the court orders the debt to be divided, the damage to Robert's score is already done. He is left trying to rebuild his life with a 620 score, which in 2026 means he is paying thousands of dollars more in interest for every major purchase he makes. Step by step, we can see how this creates a cycle of downward mobility. Because Robert's credit is damaged and his DTI is high, he cannot refinance his way out of high-interest debt. He cannot take out a home equity line of credit because he no longer has the home. He cannot even get a low-interest credit card to bridge the gap during lean months. He is forced to use his liquid cash for everything, which prevents him from saving for investments. While his non-divorce peers are using low-interest debt to acquire assets and scale their wealth, Robert is using high-cost cash to simply exist. For entrepreneurs, this credit crunch is even more devastating. Imagine a man named Steven who runs a specialized construction firm in 2026. His business relies on a revolving line of credit to purchase materials and pay subcontractors before the project draws are released. In a divorce, if his personal credit score is dragged down by joint domestic issues, his bank may choose to freeze or reduce his business line of credit. Banks in 2026 are highly sensitive to the personal stability of small business owners. If Steven loses his credit line, he loses his ability to take on larger contracts. His business stagnates or shrinks, not because he is bad at his job, but because his personal legal status has made him radioactive to the bank's risk department. This is how divorce can dismantle a man's professional legacy and his contribution to the economy. The time cost of credit repair is another factor that is rarely discussed. It takes years of perfect payment history to recover from the marks left during a 2-year divorce battle. During those years of recovery, the American economy continues to move. Opportunities for real estate investment or market entry come and go. By the time Robert's credit score returns to 750, he may be 52 years old. He has missed a 4-year window of peak mobility. The potential outcomes of this delay are cumulative. The wealth he didn't build in his late 40s cannot be made up in his 50s because he has lost the power of time. This leads us to a broader sociological point. The U.S. credit system is designed for stability. It rewards those who stay in the same place with the same people for long periods. Divorce is the ultimate disruption of that stability. For men, who are often the primary earners and therefore the primary names on the major debt obligations, the system's reaction to that disruption is punitive. We are seeing a historical trend where a man's creditworthiness is becoming a casualty of domestic law, creating a barrier to re-entry into the investor class. As we move forward in this masterclass, we have to look beyond the numbers on the credit report and the balance in the bank account. We must address the engine that generates all that wealth in the first place, the career. In the next part, we are going to explore the catastrophic intersection of divorce and professional performance. We will look at how the high-stakes environment of the American workplace in 2026 reacts to a man in the middle of a personal crisis. We will analyze the concept of the professional plateau, and why many men find their upward career trajectory permanently halted the moment they step into a family courtroom. If you think you can just outwork the financial loss, you need to see the data on how divorce actually impacts your ability to perform at the highest levels. The concept of the American dream is built on a fundamental assumption that an individual's professional output is a direct reflection of their potential for upward mobility. We are taught that if you work harder, sharpen your skills, and perform at the highest level, the market will reward you with the capital necessary to transcend your current social strata. However, for a man in 2026 undergoing the dissolution of a long-term marriage, this meritocratic engine often hits a structural wall known as the professional plateau. To understand why divorce is a primary driver of downward social mobility, we must look at how the high-stakes corporate and entrepreneurial environments of the United States react to a man whose primary focus is being diverted by the administrative and emotional machinery of the family court system. Imagine the case study of Greg, a 46-year-old vice president of operations for a mid-sized logistics firm in 2026. Greg is in his peak earning years, the decade where most men solidify their path into the upper middle class or the executive suite. In early 2026, Greg's firm is navigating a massive digital transformation, integrating autonomous fleet management and AI-driven supply chain optimization. This is a high-pressure, 60-hour-a-week role that requires absolute cognitive focus and emotional resilience. When the divorce process begins, Greg does not just lose his domestic partner, he loses his support infrastructure. Historical trends suggest that for many high-earning men, the spouse often manages the invisible labor of the household, scheduling, domestic logistics, and social networking, which allows the man to dedicate his full bandwidth to career scaling. The moment that infrastructure collapses, Greg is hit with what sociologists call the administrative burden of divorce. Step by step, his professional performance begins to erode. Every Tuesday at 10 a.m., when he should be leading a critical stakeholder meeting, he finds himself on a 30-minute call with his attorney discussing the valuation of his 401k or the specific wording of a custody agreement. In the 2026 corporate environment, where performance is tracked with granular data and real-time productivity metrics, these micro-distractions are not invisible. Greg's executive function is being consumed by a second unpaid job, the management of his own legal defense. Potential outcomes of this cognitive load include missed deadlines, decreased creative problem-solving, and a noticeable decline in leadership presence. This leads to the professional plateau. Greg was on track for a senior VP role with a significant equity package. However, his board of directors notices the subtle shift in his engagement. In a high-competition landscape, they cannot afford a leader who is distracted by a 2-year litigation process. When the promotion cycle comes around, Greg is bypassed in favor of a colleague who has the domestic stability to maintain 100% focus on the firm's growth. This is a permanent blow to Greg's social mobility. He hasn't just lost a raise. He has lost the compound growth of the equity and the future career trajectory that the senior VP title would have provided. Over a 20-year horizon, this single missed promotion can represent a $3 to $5 million loss in lifetime earnings. Furthermore, we must examine the relocation trap, a major barrier to social mobility in the United States. Economic growth in America is often geographic. To move up, you often have to move out, taking a better-paying role in a different state or a global hub. Consider the case study of Michael, a highly specialized aerospace engineer in 2026. Michael is offered a dream role in the burgeoning private space sector in Florida, a position that comes with a 40% salary increase and massive upside potential. However, Michael is in a shared custody arrangement in Ohio, under the best interests of the child standard prevalent in most U.S. jurisdictions. Michael is legally restricted from moving the children out of state without the consent of his former spouse or a lengthy, expensive court battle that he is statistically unlikely to win. Michael is forced to decline the offer. He is tethered to a specific geographic region not by economic opportunity, but by legal constraint. This is a direct hit to his social mobility. While his peers are moving to where the capital is flowing, Michael is stuck in a stagnant local market. Historical trends indicate that divorced men are significantly less mobile than their married or single counterparts, which prevents them from participating in the most lucrative sectors of the modern economy. They are essentially regionalized workers in a globalized world, a status that almost always leads to a decline in relative social standing. We also have to analyze the concept of risk aversion. Social mobility requires risk-taking. Starting a business, investing in a startup, or leaving a secure job for a high-reward opportunity. For a man like Greg or Michael, his risk tolerance in 2026 is at an all-time low. With a significant portion of his income already spoken for in the form of child support and alimony, he cannot afford the volatility of a new venture. He becomes a prisoner of the steady paycheck. He stays in a soul-crushing but stable corporate role because he has zero margin for error. If the startup fails, he still owes the court-ordered support based on his previous high-income capacity. This is the imputed income trap we discussed in the previous part, manifesting as a career cage. The man who could have been the next great American entrepreneur is instead reduced to a fearful middle manager, focused entirely on maintaining the status quo to avoid legal contempt of court. The social and professional network effect also plays a critical role. In the United States, your network is your net worth. Divorce often results in a contraction of a man's social circle. Many professional relationships are maintained through couple-based socializing. When the marriage ends, the invitations to the dinner parties, the charity galas, and the golf outings often dry up as social groups split or feel uncomfortable navigating the new dynamic. For a man seeking upward mobility, the loss of these informal high-level connections is devastating. He is no longer in the room where the big deals are discussed, or where the unofficial word of a new opening is shared. He is socially isolated at the exact moment he needs professional leverage the most. Finally, we must address the burnout cycle. To make up for the 50% loss in net worth and the ongoing monthly drain, many men attempt to outwork the divorce. They take on overtime, side hustles, or secondary consulting gigs. While this may provide a short-term cash infusion, it leads to rapid professional burnout. In the 2026 economy, burnout isn't just a feeling. It is a career-ending condition. A man who is exhausted, emotionally drained, and physically depleted cannot compete with the younger, hungrier, and more stable workforce. His performance eventually craters, leading to job loss or forced demotion, which triggers a downward spiral of social mobility that is incredibly difficult to reverse. When you look at the data, it becomes clear that the impact of divorce on a man's career is not a temporary setback. It is a structural realignment of his professional potential. He is moved from the fast track to the service track. He is no longer the builder of empires. He is the maintainer of obligations. This shift in identity and agency is perhaps the most profound way that the American legal system impacts the social hierarchy. But even as his career reaches this plateau, there is another looming threat that can finish off whatever social mobility he has left. It is the silent, back-end liquidation of his future. In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the Great Retirement Reset. We will analyze how the division of pensions, 401ks, and Social Security benefits in 2026 creates a new class of elderly poor among formerly high-earning men. We will break down why the math of retirement division is fundamentally biased against the person who has the fewest years left to work. You need to see how the wealth you haven't even touched yet is already being partitioned. The Great Retirement Reset begins with a document most men have never heard of until their lives are being dismantled: the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO. In the 2026 economic environment, where the cost of longevity is skyrocketing and the traditional safety nets of the 20th century are fraying, the division of retirement assets is the final, definitive blow to a man's social mobility. We are witnessing a historical trend where men who spent 30 years as high-status professionals are entering their 70s in a state of near poverty, not because they failed to save, but because the mathematical logic of the U.S. family court system does not account for the loss of time. Imagine the case study of Christopher, a 54-year-old senior systems engineer in Denver. Christopher has spent the last 25 years diligently contributing to his 401k, reaching a balance of $1.2 million by the start of 2026. In his mind, he was on the 5-yard line of the American dream. He had calculated that with a 7% annual return, his portfolio would swell to over $2.3 million by the time he reached 65, providing a comfortable upper-middle-class retirement. However, when his marriage of 22 years ends, that $1.2 million is not just a number. It is a marital asset. Step by step, the QDRO process begins. First, a specialized attorney must be hired to draft the order, costing Christopher an additional $3,000 to $5,000 in legal fees. Then, the court orders the plan administrator to carve out 50% of that balance. Christopher is left with $600,000. To the casual observer, $600,000 still sounds like a significant sum, but the math of social mobility is ruthless. To return to his original trajectory of $2.3 million by age 65, Christopher now needs to grow his remaining $600,000 at a rate that is biologically and economically impossible through standard market returns alone. In 2026, the IRS contribution limits for a 401k, including catch-up contributions for those over 50, hover around $35,000. Even if Christopher maximizes his contributions every single year, he cannot replace the $600,000 he lost. He has lost the most powerful engine of wealth, the compounding growth on the initial capital. The money he lost at age 54 was not just cash, it was the future harvest of seeds planted in his 30s. This is why many men in this demographic face the poverty cliff. They are forced to push their retirement date from 65 to 75, or even later, assuming their health and the 2026 labor market allow them to remain employed. Furthermore, we must analyze the division of pensions, particularly for those in the public sector or military. In many states, the Majoska's formula or similar legal precedents are used to determine a spouse's share of a pension. Imagine a case study involving a 20-year veteran of a police force or the federal government. If he was married for 15 of those 20 years, the spouse is often entitled to a massive portion of the future monthly benefit. The man is essentially working today to pay for a lifestyle he will never enjoy. When he eventually retires in the late 2020s or 2030s, his pension, which was designed to support one person at a middle-class level, is split in half. Because the cost of healthcare and housing in 2026 has outpaced pension cost of living adjustments, he finds himself unable to afford basic amenities. He moves from the status of a respected retired professional to a struggling senior, a downward shift in social strata that is often permanent. Then there is the Social Security trap. In the United States, if a marriage lasts at least 10 years, a divorced spouse is entitled to claim benefits based on the other spouse's earnings record. While this does not technically reduce the man's own monthly check, it factors into his broader financial planning in a way that often leaves him vulnerable. Many men in 2026 plan their retirement based on a dual Social Security income. When that is replaced by a single earner check, the fixed costs of life, property taxes, utilities, and Medicare premiums consume a disproportionate amount of his income. He becomes a victim of the single-person penalty. Everything from car insurance to grocery shopping is more expensive per capita for a single man than for a couple, yet his income has been structurally capped by the divorce decree. We must also look at the loss of the home as a pension. For the American middle class, the equity in a home is often the secondary retirement fund. As we discussed in earlier parts, the forced sale of the marital home in 2026 usually results in the liquidation of this equity. Instead of entering retirement with a paid-off mortgage, Christopher is now entering his 60s as a renter. In 2026, the rental market for seniors is increasingly predatory. Christopher is now exposed to annual rent hikes, whereas a fixed-rate mortgage would have provided him with stable housing costs. This exposure to market volatility in his senior years is a direct catalyst for downward mobility. He is one rent increase away from financial instability, a precarious position he never imagined he would inhabit after a successful 40-year career. Consider the potential outcomes of the healthcare gap. During a marriage, a man often benefits from shared healthcare costs or a spouse's superior employer-provided plan. Post-divorce, particularly for men who are self-employed or work for smaller firms in 2026, the cost of private health insurance is staggering. Between the ages of 55 and 65, before Medicare kicks in, a man might pay $1,800 a month for a high-deductible plan. This is capital that should be going into his depleted retirement accounts. Instead, it is being diverted to insurance carriers to mitigate the risk of a medical bankruptcy. This is the structural reality of the American system. It is expensive to be a single, aging male. Step by step, we see the destruction of the legacy. Social mobility is not just about the individual. It is about the ability to pass wealth to the next generation. Because Christopher's retirement has been halved and his housing costs have doubled, his ability to provide a step up for his children or grandchildren is gone. He will not be leaving an inheritance. He will be lucky if he does not become a financial burden to his children. This is the ultimate reversal of the American dream. He has worked his entire life to ascend the social ladder, only to have the rungs removed in the final act. In 2026, the data shows that divorced men over the age of 50 are the fastest growing demographic of the new poor. They are men who look successful on the outside, they still have the titles and the degrees, but their balance sheets are hollowed out. They are the working ghosts of the upper middle class. They are trapped in a cycle where they must work until they physically cannot, simply to maintain a standard of living that is several tiers below what they had achieved 20 years prior. This brings us to a controversial but necessary discussion. If the financial systems and legal structures are so heavily weighted against the late career male, how does this impact his incentive to continue contributing to the economy at a high level? When the finish line is moved 20 miles back, many men simply stop running. In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to explore the great opt-out. We will analyze the historical trends of men intentionally downshifting their careers, reducing their productivity, and exiting the high-stakes labor market as a rational response to the divorce industrial complex. If you cannot keep what you earn, why earn at all? We are going to look at the macroeconomic impact of a generation of men who have decided that the climb is no longer worth the fall. The great opt-out is not a sudden strike or a loud protest. It is a quiet, calculated withdrawal from the high-stakes machinery of the American economy. To understand the macroeconomic consequences of divorce for men in 2026, we have to view the individual man as a rational economic actor. In the United States, the engine of social mobility is fueled by the incentive to earn more, create more, and innovate more. However, when the legal and financial structures of divorce effectively place 100% tax on a man's marginal effort, the incentive to climb the ladder disappears. This creates a phenomenon where some of the most productive members of the U.S. workforce, men in their peak earning years, decide that the additional stress of high performance is no longer worth the fractional return they are allowed to keep. Consider the case study of Jason, a 47-year-old software engineering director in Seattle. In early 2026, Jason is at the top of his game. He manages a team of 80 developers working on the next generation of decentralized cloud infrastructure. His total compensation package, including stock options, is $450,000. In his previous life, this income was the foundation of his family's upward trajectory. But post-divorce, Jason's financial reality has shifted. After federal taxes, Washington state's various payroll deductions, and his court-ordered support payments, Jason realizes that if he pushes for the next promotion to vice president, a role that would require an extra 20 hours of work per week and significantly higher stress, his net increase in take-home pay would be less than 15% of the gross raise. In Jason's mind, the math is clear. Every additional dollar he earns is subject to a high effective tax rate because a portion is automatically diverted to alimony and child support, which, as we established, are paid with after-tax dollars. Furthermore, in many 2026 jurisdictions, a significant increase in income can trigger a motion for a modification of support. Jason realizes that by succeeding, he is essentially funding his own continued litigation. If he earns more, he provides more resources for his former spouse to hire higher-priced legal counsel to pursue even more of his assets. This is the incentive paradox. The more successful a man becomes post-divorce, the more he is penalized by the system that was supposed to reward his mobility. Historical trends show that men in Jason's position often engage in what sociologists call the brake tap. They stop chasing the C-suite. They decline the high-stakes projects. They might even leave the corporate world entirely to become independent contractors or consultants, intentionally capping their income at a level that is manageable, but does not trigger the upper tiers of support formulas. This is a direct hit to U.S. social mobility. We are seeing a brain drain where highly skilled men are opting for roles that are below their capability, because the financial reward for excellence has been decoupled from the effort. When thousands of Jasons across the country decide to coast instead of lead, the aggregate loss to American innovation and the tax base is staggering. Now, let us imagine a different scenario with a character named Brandon, a 42-year-old specialized surgeon in Florida. Brandon's role is critical. He performs complex cardiovascular procedures that few others in his region can handle. In 2026, the healthcare system is already strained. Following a high-conflict divorce where Brandon's professional reputation was used as leverage in court, he experiences a profound shift in his worldview. He transitions from being a man who identified as a high-achieving provider to a man who feels like a utility of the state. He looks at his schedule, 60 hours of life or death pressure, and then looks at his bank statement, which shows that after his obligations, he has the same discretionary income as a mid-level administrator. Brandon chooses the exit. He moves to a part-time locum tenens model, working only 6 months a year and spending the other 6 months in a low-cost, high-lifestyle region like the Appalachian Mountains, or even expatriating to a lower-cost country. He is still a doctor, but his contribution to the U.S. medical system and the economy has been halved. The potential outcomes of this choice are twofold. Brandon preserves his mental health and avoids the burnout cycle, but the community loses a vital specialist, and the ladder of social mobility he was climbing is abandoned. Brandon has chosen a horizontal life over a vertical one. When social mobility becomes a game where you have to run twice as fast just to stay in the same place, the rational choice is to stop running. This leads us to the concept of the shadow economy of divorce. In 2026, we are seeing an increase in men seeking out-of-the-box economic arrangements to protect their remaining autonomy. This includes shifting toward cash-based businesses, bartering services, or focusing on non-taxable perks like corporate housing or travel allowances, rather than raw salary. While this is often discussed in the context of avoiding support, from a sociological perspective, it is a desperate attempt to regain control over one's labor. It is a rebellion against a system that treats a man's future potential as a static commodity to be pre-sold and distributed. This withdrawal of high-quality labor from the formal market creates a drag on the entire U.S. economy, reducing the velocity of capital and slowing down the growth of the very institutions that sustain the middle class. We must also analyze the impact on the entrepreneurial spirit. Historically, the United States has been the land of the second act. If a man fails, he is expected to pick himself up and try again. But the 2026 divorce framework makes the second act incredibly difficult. If a man's first business was liquidated or its value divided in a divorce, he lacks the seed capital to start a second. More importantly, he lacks the protection. In many U.S. states, the growth in the value of a business started after a divorce can still be subject to complex legal claims if the original case remains open or if there are ongoing support modifications. The fear of having a second success dismantled by a first failure acts as a permanent damper on male entrepreneurship. We are losing the businesses that would have been started in 2026 and 2027 because the men who would have started them are too busy defending their past to invest in their future. The step-by-step erosion of the work ethic is perhaps the most invisible but damaging aspect of this trend. When a man feels that he is no longer the master of his fate, his relationship with his work changes. Work is no longer a source of pride or a path to legacy. It becomes a chore. This psychological shift, multiplied by millions of men, leads to a decline in the quality of the American workforce. It affects mentorship, as these men are less likely to invest time in training the next generation when they themselves are looking for the exit. It affects corporate culture, as the most experienced leaders become the most disengaged. The great opt-out is the final stage of the downward mobility cycle for the individual man. He has been through the immediate shock, the monthly drain, the credit collapse, and the professional plateau. He finally realizes that the system is not designed for his recovery. He accepts a lower social status in exchange for peace and the preservation of whatever autonomy he has left. He stops trying to be the VP, the surgeon, or the founder. He becomes the guy who does just enough to get by. In a country that prides itself on being the land of opportunity, this mass resignation of high-potential men is a red flag for the future of the American economy. But the story of social mobility and divorce doesn't end with the man himself. The most profound and long-lasting impact of this economic disruption isn't what happens to the father. It's what happens to the next generation. We are currently creating a fatherless wealth gap that will echo through the U.S. economy for decades. In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to look at the intergenerational transmission of poverty. We will analyze how the destruction of the father's net worth in 2026 directly impacts the education, networking, and inheritance of his children. We will break down the data on why children of high conflict, high-cost divorces are statistically less likely to reach the same social strata as their parents. You need to see how the cost of a divorce is being billed to your children's future. The fatherless wealth gap is not merely a headline. It is a structural reality that is currently reshaping the American class system in 2026. To understand the intergenerational impact of divorce on social mobility, we must view wealth not as a static bank balance, but as a multi-generational relay race. In the United States, the primary driver of upward mobility has historically been the ability of one generation to provide a slightly higher floor for the next. This is achieved through three specific mechanisms: the funding of elite education, the provision of social capital, and the transfer of unfragmented assets. When a man's wealth is dismantled in a high-conflict divorce, the baton is not just dropped. It is effectively incinerated before it can reach the next runner. Imagine the case study of Kevin, a 52-year-old corporate attorney in Chicago. In 2026, Kevin's son Leo is preparing to enter his freshman year at a top-tier private university. Before the divorce, Kevin and his spouse had a joint financial plan that included a fully funded $529 college savings plan and a clear path to paying for Leo's graduate school. This is the hallmark of the American professional class, ensuring the next generation starts their career with zero debt and a high-status credential. However, during the 2-year litigation process, the $529 plan became a point of contention. In many historical trends, these accounts are either frozen during the dispute or, in some cases, the principal is used to offset other asset divisions. Step by step, the wealth gap begins to widen for Leo. Because Kevin's liquid savings were exhausted by legal fees and his monthly cash flow is now dominated by alimony payments, he can no longer bridge the gap between the $529 balance and the 2026 cost of tuition, which has continued to outpace inflation. Leo is forced to take on 6-figure student loans. This is the first major blow to Leo's social mobility. While his peers from intact professional class families graduate and immediately begin investing in their 401ks or saving for a down payment on a home, Leo enters the workforce with a massive liability. He is starting 10 yards behind the starting line. The wealth that Kevin spent 20 years accumulating was intended to buy Leo's freedom. Instead, the divorce has effectively taxed Leo's future earnings for the next 2 decades. Beyond the liquid capital, we must analyze the erosion of social capital. In the United States, social mobility is often a function of who you know and where you live. This is known as the zip code effect. When Kevin is forced to sell the family home in an elite suburban enclave and move into a high-rise rental or a more modest neighborhood, the social fabric of Leo's life changes. In 2026, the networking opportunities that lead to high-status internships and first jobs are often informal. They happen at neighborhood gatherings, country clubs, and through parental professional circles. Divorce frequently results in a social contraction. Kevin, focused on financial survival and potentially working more hours to cover his obligations, is no longer active in the social circles that provided Leo with warm leads in the labor market. Leo loses the intangible benefit of being the son of a prominent, well-connected couple, and becomes the son of a distracted, financially strained single father. Then there is the catastrophic loss of the step-up in basis and the inheritance shredder. For many American families, the most significant transfer of wealth occurs through the inheritance of the primary residence. If Kevin and his spouse had remained together, Leo would have eventually inherited a property with decades of appreciation. Under current tax laws, Leo would receive that home at its fair market value at the time of death, potentially avoiding hundreds of thousands of dollars in capital gains taxes. However, because the home was sold in 2026 to facilitate the divorce settlement, that asset was liquidated. The capital was split, taxed, and a large portion was consumed by the dual living expenses of 2 households over the subsequent 20 years. By the time Leo reaches his own middle age, the family estate has been atomized. There is no home to inherit, no concentrated capital to pass down. Leo is the first generation in his family line to experience downward mobility, not because of his own lack of effort, but because the family's economic engine was dismantled. We also have to consider the potential outcomes of the safety net effect. Social mobility in the 2026 economy requires a high degree of risk-taking. To move into the upper middle class, An individual often needs to leave a stable job to start a company or move to an expensive city for a high-upside opportunity. Young adults from wealthy, stable families can take these risks because they have a safety net. They know that if the venture fails, they will not be homeless. Leo, seeing his father Kevin struggle to maintain a basic standard of living post-divorce, loses that psychological and financial security. He becomes hyper-risk averse. He chooses the safe, mid-level corporate job over the high-growth startup. This risk aversion is a silent killer of social mobility. It traps the next generation in a cycle of maintenance rather than growth. Furthermore, we must address the data on the educational plateau. Historical trends suggest that children in households experiencing high-conflict divorce and the subsequent economic decline of the father often see a dip in academic performance and a decrease in the likelihood of pursuing advanced degrees. This isn't just about the money. It's about the loss of the mentorship and the stability required for high-level cognitive focus. If Kevin is working 70 hours a week in 2026 to pay off his divorce-related debts, he is not there to mentor Leo through the complexities of a law or medical school application. The guidance that helps a child navigate the gatekeepers of the American elite is lost. This creates a phenomenon we are calling the professional inheritance gap. In the 2026 labor market, having a parent who can provide specialized career guidance is worth more than a small cash gift. But when the father is in a state of professional stagnation or burnout, as we discussed in earlier parts, that guidance is absent. Leo is left to figure out the rules of the game on his own, while his competition is being coached by parents who have the time, energy, and resources to stay engaged. The cumulative effect of these disadvantages, debt, social isolation, liquidated assets, and risk aversion, means that Leo is statistically likely to end his career in a lower social stratum than the one Kevin inhabited at the peak of his marriage. The fatherless wealth gap is the ultimate tragedy of the modern American divorce. It is the realization that the cost of the split is not just paid in the present, it is a debt that is compounded and passed to the next generation. We are seeing the emergence of a new demographic in the United States, the downwardly mobile children of the formerly affluent. They have the tastes and expectations of the upper middle class, but the bank accounts and debt loads of the working class. They are the collateral damage of a legal system that focuses on the immediate division of the pie, without considering the loss of the oven that bakes it. As we look at the wreckage of the intergenerational American dream, we have to ask, is there a way to see the cliff before you drive over it? Is it possible to navigate the 2026 landscape in a way that preserves mobility even when the marriage fails? In the next part of this masterclass, we are going to pivot from the data of destruction to the strategies of survival. We will explore the concept of the strategic separation and the historical trends of men who successfully shielded their social mobility through preemptive legal and financial planning. We will look at the new playbook for the 2026 economy. If you are already in the process, or if you see the clouds on the horizon, the next part will be the most critical information you will ever hear. We are going to show you the difference between those who are buried by the system and those who find the path to a second act. Navigation in 2026 requires a shift from emotional reactivity to surgical precision. If the first 8 parts of this masterclass have illustrated the structural wreckage that divorce can leave in its wake, Part 9 is about the countermove. Historical trends show that the men who successfully preserve their social mobility are not necessarily those who fought the hardest, but those who understood the economic physics of the system before the first document was served. In the United States, survival in 2026 is a game of data, timing, and the preservation of the margin. To see the difference between a total economic collapse and a strategic pivot, we must look at the case study of Brian, a 45-year-old data architect in Phoenix, Arizona. Imagine if Brian, unlike our previous case studies, recognized the volatility in his domestic life 18 months before a legal separation was ever mentioned. In 2026, the cost of information is low, but the cost of ignorance is astronomical. Brian's strategy began with what we call the forensic self-audit. Before any legal action was taken, Brian spent 6 months documenting the character of every asset in his name. In many U.S. jurisdictions, the distinction between marital property and separate property is the primary battleground of social mobility. Brian meticulously traced a $40,000 inheritance he received 3 years prior, ensuring it was never commingled with the joint checking account used for household expenses. By maintaining the separate nature of this capital, he preserved a seed fund for his post-divorce life that the court could not touch. This is a crucial potential outcome of early preparation, the protection of the non-marital floor. Step by step, Brian then addressed the litigation trap. In 2026, the average hourly rate for a high-level family law attorney in a major U.S. city has climbed to $550. In a contested trial, it is not uncommon for each side to spend over $100,000 in fees alone. Brian calculated that this $200,000 total loss to the family estate represented 5 years of his children's future college tuition. Instead of preparing for war, he prepared for a peace buyout. This historical trend involves making a slightly above-market settlement offer early in the process to avoid the attrition of a multi-year legal battle. Brian offered his spouse a larger share of the liquid cash in exchange for full retention of his retirement accounts and his professional intellectual property. By trading the present for the future, Brian avoided the QDRO nightmare we discussed in Part 6. He kept his compound interest engine intact, sacrificing short-term liquidity for long-term social mobility. We must also analyze the 2026 mediation advantage. Brian insisted on a collaborative divorce model, which is becoming a preferred path for the American professional class. In mediation, the goal is not to win, but to solve a multivariable math problem. Because Brian and his spouse avoided the courtroom, they maintained control over the timeline. In the U.S. court system of 2026, backlogs can keep a case in limbo for 24 months. During that time, as we've seen, assets are frozen and the professional plateau begins to set in. By settling in 4 months through mediation, Brian minimized the duration of his productivity dip. He remained focused at work, secured his annual bonus, and prevented the burnout that claimed the careers of Jason and Greg. His social mobility remained on an upward slope because he refused to let the legal process become a full-time job. Another critical strategy in the 2026 landscape is the housing pivot. Brian realized that fighting over the marital home was a zero-sum game that would likely lead to a forced sale in a high-interest rate environment. Instead of clinging to the property, he negotiated a clean break. He helped facilitate the sale of the home immediately, capturing the peak equity and splitting it fairly. He then used his half of the equity to purchase a smaller, high-yield property in an emerging neighborhood, rather than trying to replicate his previous lifestyle in a stagnant suburb. This is what we call step down to step up. By lowering his fixed costs immediately, Brian increased his monthly margin. He lived below his means for 2 years post-divorce, funneling every extra dollar back into the market. While other men were struggling to pay for 2 houses they couldn't afford, Brian was rebuilding his balance sheet from a position of lean efficiency. Furthermore, we must look at the tax strategy of 2026. Brian worked with a specialized divorce financial analyst to structure his support payments. While alimony is no longer deductible at the federal level, Brian and his counsel looked for creative ways to handle child-related expenses that maximize tax credits and head-of-household filing status. By understanding the nuances of the 2026 tax code, Brian was able to reduce his effective tax rate by 4% compared to the standard divorce outcome. In the world of high earners, a 4% swing in tax efficiency over 10 years is the difference between a funded retirement and a decade of extra work. The psychological discipline Brian exhibited is perhaps the most important data point. He viewed the divorce as a corporate restructuring rather than a personal failure. This allowed him to maintain his professional network. Instead of withdrawing from his circles out of shame, he was transparent with his mentors and peers. He framed his situation as a transition, not a crisis. As a result, his social capital did not evaporate. In late 2026, one of his professional contacts offered him a seat on a private equity board, a role he wouldn't have had the bandwidth for if he were still embroiled in a high-conflict trial. This new income stream more than offset his alimony obligations, effectively neutralizing the monthly drain. Case studies of men like Brian show that social mobility post-divorce is possible, but it is not the default. It requires a level of emotional detachment that most men find difficult to achieve in the heat of a domestic split. It requires treating your own life like a distressed asset that needs a turnaround plan. Step by step, Brian de-risked his life. He diversified his income, protected his time, and liquidated his ego before the system could liquidate his net worth. He understood that in the United States the law is a framework but the outcome is often a negotiation. By being the most prepared person in the room, he dictated the terms of his own recovery. However, Brian is an outlier in 2026. For the vast majority of men, the structural forces of the U.S. legal and economic systems are too heavy to pivot around so easily. We are seeing a historical trend where the risks of the traditional family structure are beginning to outweigh the perceived rewards for a growing segment of the population. This realization is leading to a fundamental shift in the American social contract. Men are not just looking for ways to survive divorce anymore. They are starting to ask if the initial investment is worth the potential outcome. As we conclude this part of the masterclass, we have to look toward the final horizon. We have covered the destruction of wealth, the erosion of the career, the impact on the next generation, and the narrow path to survival. But what does this mean for the future of the United States? We are standing at the edge of a massive demographic shift. In our final part, we are going to explore the emergence of the marriage strike and the rise of the solo wealth builder. We will analyze how the 2026 economic reality is creating a new class of men who have decided to opt out of the traditional family unit entirely to protect their social mobility. We will look at the long-term projections for the American economy, the housing market, and the very definition of a successful life. The final piece of the puzzle is not about how to survive the system. It's about how the system itself is being forced to change because men are no longer willing to play a game they are rigged to lose. We are witnessing the emergence of a new economic class in the United States. The solo wealth builder. By the year 2026, the data has become too loud to ignore. The historical trends of wealth destruction we have analyzed in this masterclass have led to a fundamental shift in the risk assessment models of the modern American man. When the cost of a domestic exit is perceived as 100% tax on 20 years of labor, the rational response is not just to survive the system, but to bypass it entirely. This is the final piece of the social mobility puzzle. We are seeing a generation of men who have realized that in the current 2026 economic landscape, the most effective way to protect their upward trajectory is to decouple their financial legacy from the traditional family unit. Consider the case study of Anthony, a 34-year-old cybersecurity expert living in Charlotte. Anthony is at the age where, 10 years ago, he would have been the prime demographic for the domestic industrial complex, buying a 4-bedroom suburban home, financing 2 SUVs, and entering a 20-year mortgage. However, Anthony has watched the previous generation, men like James, Greg, and Christopher, experience the catastrophic liquidation of their assets. He has seen the professional plateau and the great retirement reset firsthand. Consequently, Anthony's approach to social mobility in 2026 is based on a concept called the risk-adjusted life. Imagine if Anthony chooses to remain a solo wealth builder. Step by step, his balance sheet begins to look fundamentally different from his married peers. Because he does not have the redundant expenses of a high-conflict domestic life or the looming threat of asset division, Anthony's velocity of wealth is significantly higher. He funnels 40% of his income into diversified, non-commingled assets, high-yield digital bonds, specialized real estate investment trusts, and international equities. In 2026, Anthony is not just saving for retirement, he is building a fortress. His social mobility is not dependent on a dual-income household. It is fueled by his own unburdened margin. Potential outcomes of this strategy include a net worth that reaches the top 5% of his age group by age 40, a feat that historical trends show is increasingly difficult for his married counterparts who are servicing the high costs of family formation and potential dissolution. This leads us to the phenomenon known as the marriage strike. While often discussed in emotional terms in 2026, this is primarily an economic protest. For the high-earning man, marriage has evolved into a contract with a massive downside and a structurally capped upside. Sociologists are documenting a historical trend where the peak earners in the U.S. economy are opting for long-term cohabitation, or living apart together arrangements, rather than legal marriage. This is a strategy for social mobility that prioritizes the preservation of capital. By avoiding the legal framework of the family court system, these men are retaining 100% of their borrowing power, their credit scores, and their ability to pivot professionally without seeking court permission. Now, consider the macroeconomic impact of this shift on the United States. The American economy has long been driven by the family unit. The housing market, the automotive sector, and the insurance industry are all calibrated for the traditional household. As millions of men like Anthony opt for solo wealth building, we are seeing a structural realignment of the U.S. housing market. In 2026, the demand for large suburban family homes is being replaced by a surge in high-end, single-occupancy luxury developments in urban hubs. This is not just a change in architecture. It is the physical manifestation of a social class that has decided to prioritize liquidity over legacy. When men stop buying the forever home, the velocity of capital in the real estate market changes. leading to a more volatile and institutionalized housing sector. Furthermore, we must analyze the concept of capital flight at the individual level. In earlier parts of this masterclass, we saw how men like Michael were tethered to stagnant local markets because of custody and support laws. The 2026 solo wealth builder is hypermobile. Because he has no legal tethers, he can move to whichever state offers the most favorable tax environment or whichever global hub offers the highest salary. This mobility is the ultimate engine of social mobility. He can chase the boom in Nashville today and the AI explosion in Palo Alto tomorrow. He is a professional nomad whose social status is tied to his skills and his liquid capital, rather than a fixed piece of real estate or a specific social circle. But what does this mean for the future of the American class system? Historical trends suggest that we are moving toward a bifurcated society. On one side, we have the traditional household, which is increasingly precarious and vulnerable to the divorce trap that sends men down the social ladder. On the other side, we have the rise of the autonomous earner, who maintains a high social standing but operates outside the traditional social fabric. This creates a gap in the intergenerational transmission of wealth. If the most productive and mobile men in 2026 are opting out of family formation to protect their wealth, who will inherit the American middle class? We are looking at a future where social mobility is a solo sport, and the collective wealth of the nation becomes increasingly fragmented. Step by step, the legal system is also feeling the pressure of this shift. In 2026, there is a growing movement for family law reform that aims to bring domestic contracts into alignment with the modern economy. This includes potential outcomes like the expansion of prenuptial enforceability, the capping of alimony durations, and the transition toward a default 50-50 custody model that reduces the incentives for high-conflict litigation. However, these changes move slowly. For the man standing in 2026, the choice is between waiting for the system to change or changing how he interacts with the system. In this deep dive masterclass, we have explored the dark side of the American dream. We have seen how the intersection of family law and economic reality can act as a gravity well, pulling even the most successful men into a cycle of downward mobility. We have broken down the math of the monthly drain, the credit collapse, and the professional plateau. We have seen how the costs are billed to the next generation through the fatherless wealth gap. And finally, we have looked at the strategic pivots that men are taking to survive and thrive in this new landscape. The ultimate takeaway is that social mobility in the United States is no longer a given. It is a defensive operation. For a man in 2026, the preservation of his status requires a level of financial literacy and legal awareness that was never required of his father or grandfather. You cannot simply work hard and hope for the best. You must understand the structural mechanics of the environment you inhabit. You must treat your career, your assets, and your domestic choices with the same level of scrutiny that a CEO treats a multi-billion-dollar merger. The ladder is still there, but it is no longer bolted to the wall. It is a high-wire act, and the safety net has been removed. This concludes our 10-part masterclass on divorce for men and U.S. social mobility. But while we have finished the deep dive into the financial and structural mechanics of the split, we are only beginning to explore the psychological and professional strategies for the second act. The world of 2026 is moving faster than ever, and those who do not adapt are being left behind in the wreckage of the old model. In our upcoming series, we are going to look beyond the numbers and into the high-performance psychology of the post-divorce turnaround. We will analyze the case studies of men who didn't just survive the reset, but used it as a catalyst to build empires that were previously impossible. We will look at the rise of the global asset protector and the new rules for building a legacy in a borderless digital world. If you want to know how the most resilient men in America are rewriting the rules of the game to ensure they never fall again, you won't want to miss what we have coming next. The story of your mobility is still being written, and the next chapter is where the real growth begins.